In the year 1895, a story from Ireland made news around the world. A husband had burned his wife, claiming that he thought that she had been replaced by a fairy. News of the story reached all corners of the world, showing the contrast between the old Ireland, which used folk tales and fairy lore to explain the everyday happenings, and the modern-day Ireland. Angela Burke accounted for this huge outpouring of media response to the death of Bridget Cleary by saying that, like a rock in a stream, Bridget Cleary's violent death caused ripples that traveled far, for she died just as newspapers, trains, and telegrams were revolutionizing communications. It must be considered that the way in which the world is seen today is through a lens which has been sculpted by the current culture, media, and society. The story of Bridget Cleary gives those studying folklore and Irish history insight into how the culture of the Irish has changed, as the events occurred upon a short tipping point between traditional Ireland and a modern Ireland. Angela Burke in The Baby in the Bathwater attributes some of this drastic change in perspective to the Great Hunger of 1845, which resulted in the death of many poor Irish labourers, with whom died many oral Irish traditions and folk tales. In examining the impact of the story of Bridget Cleary, it is essential first to discuss the life and death of the woman herself. The story of Bridget Cleary is only reported on by her relatives. However, there are many different sources available in order to gain as complete an understanding as possible, including books such as His Wife is Missing by Joan Hoff and Marion Yates, and The Burning of Bridget Cleary by Angela Burke, as well as academic papers by some leading Irish historians. The story of Bridget Cleary takes place in Clonmel, located on the south side of the River Suir in the south of County Tipperary, Ireland. In a slate-roofed labourer's cottage, a 26-year-old woman named Bridget Cleary was lying ill in her bed, surrounded by family members. She had become ill with a slight bronchial cataract while walking to sell eggs a mile from her home. Cleary also had a history of a nervous complaint, which she had suffered from for 8 or 9 years. Her husband, Michael Cleary, had sent for both a priest named Father Ryan and a doctor named Dr. Crean in order to treat her conditions. The Clearys had been married for 8 years, and Hoff notes that, though life appeared to be going well for the young couple, strains began to develop in the relationship. The marriage was childless, and Bridget seemed to enjoy the freedom associated with being childless, and was a very independent, almost fiery woman. Cleary was charming, however had the reputation of being a bit queer. Hoff notes that it was Bridget's increasing fascination with the fairy faith, however, especially after her mother's death in February 1894, that set the Cooper and his wife at odds. According to Hoff, Bridget began to visit fairy forts, and speculation emerged that she was going to meet a lover, perhaps Jack Dempsey, although the potential lover has been debated by different scholars. When the traditional methods used by the priest and doctor failed to cure Cleary of her conditions, Michael Cleary turned to Dennis Gainey, a local fairy doctor, who prescribed an herbal cure for Cleary, which was meant to expel the changeling. Refusing to eat the mixture, a hot poker had to be used in order to force her to take the herbs. Convinced his wife was a changeling, Cleary proceeded to shake her, crying, away with you, come home Bridget Cleary, in the name of God."
His insistence that his wife was not in fact his wife was justified by the idea that Bridget had been replaced by a changeling. McGrath knows that it was probably believed that fairies substituted one of their own kind, a changeling, in place of a person abducted by them. In order to rid the fairy and get a loved one back, herbal mixtures and fire was used. Yates, collector and editor for the book Fairy and Folktales of Ireland, recorded 4 different tales of changelings in his book. The story of Bridget Cleary took a violent turn when Michael Cleary continued to insist that she was not indeed his wife, but rather a changeling. Upon Bridget's refusal to eat 3 pieces of bread, her husband held her over the fire and threw a lamp on her in a fit of rage, and watched his wife burn surrounded by family members. He then buried the body and went to the church, incredibly distressed. He then went to Kylangranaha Hill, Fairyford, where he spent 3 days waiting for his wife to return, on a building an alibi. When the police uncovered the body of Cleary, they arrested 10 people for willful murder. However, the charges of willful murder were dropped to bodily harm, with the exception of Michael Cleary, who was found guilty of manslaughter. The sensational part of the story is that the excuse of thinking that his wife was a changeling allowed Cleary to be convicted only of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. Stories about fairies, such as the one of Bridget Cleary, normally encode information about topics that were not spoken of. Changeling tales could be used in a variety of ways, as cautions to children or adults against departures from society's norms, as euphemisms for anything from tuberculosis to drunkenness to marital infidelity, or simply as entertainment. This would explain why the changeling creature would generally be sick, as Bridget Cleary was. Nevertheless, we find that changeling stories could also account for marital infidelity, and sometimes accidents and acts of violence. Thomas McGrath writes in his paper, Fairy Faith and Changelings, that fairies were scapegoats for chance, ill luck, and misfortunes. And given the widespread belief in them in the case in questions, the changeling idea provided a human and logical explanation for the illness which affected a woman. It was the tragic paradox of Bridget Cleary's death that the participants believed that they were acting in her interests. However, there is a possibility that even though the community thought that they were helping Bridget by allowing her husband to burn her, the changeling type behind Bridget Cleary's story could also be called for an unhappy marriage due to being unable to have children. There's evidence that Michael Cleary had attempted to burn his wife the previous Christmas in December 1894, and even when the community seemed convinced at Bridget's answers to the questions confirming her identity, Mr. Cleary was reluctant to believe her. In addition, the burning seemed like a violent action, according to Burke, without a previous premeditation, decreasing the likelihood that it was simply a ritual to expel the changeling. We will never know Michael Cleary's true intentions when he burned the unfortunate Bridget Cleary, whether it was a crime of passion encoding marital trouble or a true belief in changeling lore.